Good morning and welcome back. We're going to pick back up in the 1930s today. And today we're going to talk about foreign policy in the 1930s, American isolationism, neutrality policy in the face of developing fascist regimes in Europe and uh, Asia, and the um, prospect of a Second World War, and how did Americans respond to these events. So, as we know from the last lecture about the New Deal, and we went through the entire 1932 to 39 on the domestic front in the last lecture. Today, we're going to be covering most of these same years, and we'll dip back into the 1920s very briefly to look at these sort of global developments that became an increasing concern to the American people, and conversations begin about, what would be America's position in the likelihood that Europe could again go to war. What would be the position of the United States? Of course, this was a major conversation during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and this same conversation would now come back in the 1930s during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. So, really, some of American foreign policy in the 1930s, because the Great Depression was a global depression, a lot of it will revolve around economic matters. So let's start there. We talked in the lecture on Herbert Hoover and the Depression about the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was designed to ultimately protect 75 different American farm products, but a lot of other items wound up getting thrown into the bill that weren't farm products. And this was a tariff that led to sort of international tariff wars. We cited that was an example, of economic nationalism, and how nations threw up, as a result of this tariff, trade barriers to one another in the form of retaliatory tariffs, where essentially it made it impossible for the circulation of goods to take place, as every nation was placing such heavy tariffs on each other's products that ultimately it deepened and worsened the Great Depression. Okay. So here, let's pick up in about 1935. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff, of course, remember, was passed in 1930, and we've seen a steady worsening of the depression. In fact, we can say 1933-34, actually during Roosevelt's first year and a half, maybe 2 years, were actually the worst years in terms of the lowest lows, right? So in 1935, the United States begins to try to undo some of the damage caused by the Smoot-Hawley tariff, because as he's got these new programs in place, the NIRA and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, for example, which we talked about in the previous lecture, we want to now that we're getting American products produced at stable prices, we now want to be able to exchange those internationally, sell them overseas. And when we're able to start recreating those overseas markets, then we don't necessarily have to limit production as much to artificially inflate prices, right? That water will begin to find its own natural level, so to speak. So, beginning in 1935, the United States goes about trying to sign, okay, a number of reciprocal trade agreements with other countries, okay, the RTAs, or reciprocal trade agreements. The U.S. signs over 20 of these trade deals, right? You hear, for example, President Trump talking about the USMCA, the United States Mexico Canada Trade Agreement, right? We got rid of the NAFTA agreement, or a new trade agreement with China. So we're just making trade deals at this point, trying to undo the damage that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had caused. So we signed over 20 of these trade deals during the 1930s. Most favored nation status is a status that is conferred upon nations that conclude these deals with the United States. Okay, so most favored nation status means that the nation signing that would be a highly favored nation by the United States and would therefore be subjected to the lowest possible threshold of tariffs. When your products came into the United States, they would be assigned the lowest tariff rates possible. That's what most favored nation status was. So when the United States concluded these reciprocal trade agreements with foreign powers, and a lot of these are getting done. We enter into the process 1935. By 1937, 1938, we have a lot of nations, over 20 now, that have been assigned this most favored nation status. So this begins to open up some channels of international trade again. One of the things that's not typically spoken about, I think your textbook referred to it, was the fact that during this period, Franklin Roosevelt became the first American president to recognize the Soviet Union in the hopes of getting a huge market for American industrial products, heavy machinery products, right? In other words, heavy machinery could be like the equipment needed to build a dam, right? It could be the equipment needed to build and operate a factory. So, heavy machinery. We are the world's great producer of that, along with Germany. And the Soviet Union, which I've mentioned in a previous lecture, was a communist dictatorship that rose up in a peasant society, an agricultural society. So it was sort of contrary to Marxist theory. The idea was that a socialist nation, had to be an advanced industrial nation in order for the quote unquote revolution to take place, right? So a nation that was going to become socialist and then ultimately communist would first have to be highly industrialized. That's why everyone thought it would take place in Germany first. However, it unexpectedly happened in an agricultural society, Russia. So at that point, Soviet leaders, particularly Joseph Stalin, has the plan to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. He wants to rapidly jump an entire phase of Marxist-Leninist theory and have the Soviet Union catch up in terms of its historical stage that it was in. So he's trying to rapidly advance the nation from agrarianism to industrialism. And he did this with his, of course, famous 5-year plan. So from 1928 to 33, this had been Stalin's big object, which I guess is no longer, well, it does still hold because it didn't happen in Philadelphia. So that always brings me to that great question of history. What is the difference between Joseph Stalin and Andy Reid? The answer is Stalin's 5-year plan worked. That's from a bitter Eagle fan. Andy Reid won much later, but he came to Philadelphia trumpeting his 5-year plan for a Super Bowl. And we waited. And we waited. So anyway, Franklin Roosevelt did recognize the Soviet Union and began trade relations with them. And the United States is selling a lot of heavy machinery and stuff like that to the Soviet Union during this period. So, when that Russian Revolution had taken place in 1917, and then particularly the Bolshevik Revolution later in the fall of that year, none of the Western powers would diplomatically recognize the communist government of the Soviet Union. And that's not being mean, okay? The avowed purpose of the Soviet Union was the destruction of Western capitalist democracy. I mean, it's right there in their playbook, in their manifesto, in their declarations of why they exist. This is our goal: destroy the Western capitalist democracies and create a global worker state. Okay? And there's people who are still at this game, by the way. Okay, see China. Okay. Anyway, nobody wanted to obviously be allies with them. Okay, so Roosevelt opens that door to find markets for. He's experimenting. He's trying anything, and he wants markets for American products. So he's even willing to go that route. Okay, so during this period, also, the United States is active in concluding friendship, commerce, and navigation treaties. Okay, friendship FCN treaties, better known as friendship commerce and navigation treaties. Now, these are nothing new. It's just not something we're doing for the first time in the 1930s. These actually date back to the colonial era, to colonial America. For example, our first FCN treaty was concluded much through the offices of Benjamin Franklin in 1778 with France. Right, that was, in fact, it's called the Franco-American Treaty of Amity and Commerce. Right, and what is amity? Amity is friendship. Right, so it was an amity and commerce treaty. And then navigation here, the term navigation refers to um, who's actually carrying the goods, the right to carry goods into another nation's country. So this again dates back to problems that came from the colonial era, when the British would only allow um, products to be carried into their ports in British ships to ensure full employment for British sailors and seamen, and to protect the British shipbuilding industries. Right, so there's a whole economy around shipping that was vital to the British Empire. And this was a big um, point of contention between both the American colonies, the colonists, right, and then particularly the new American Republic after independence. We had all kinds of problems with the British over this question of navigation and the carrying trade, right? So friendship, commerce, and navigation means we're cool, right? We have diplomacy. I have ambassadors in your country. You have ambassadors in my country. We have diplomatic relations. We trade with one another on agreeable principles, and my ships can carry my goods into your port. That's what all that represents. So again, these date back to colonial America. Um, all of these treaties expire, however, and have to be renewed. Okay, so they all have a 20-year expiration date, just like everything. See, corporate charters, everything had 20-year expiration dates. So these expired and had to be renewed. So, for example, George Washington's farewell address, he is warning 2 years in advance to not renew the treaty with France. That's his whole bit about avoid entangling alliances, right? Because the French government at this time, and I mentioned this in the lecture on Woodrow Wilson, the new French government had killed the old French government, right? They had beheaded Louis XVI. So a lot can change in 20 years, and Washington was cautioning against getting involved in these things, right? But Wilson had launched us back into a new sort of global position. This is a big point here. This is the new American posture, and I should mention this early in the lecture. The new American posture on an international on the international scene was known as Wilsonian internationalism. Right, the United States had come out of its uh, long-standing neutrality dating back to the 1790s, and had suddenly taken sides and involved itself in one of Europe's wars. Right, so Woodrow Wilson, as we talked about, made a major break with American foreign policy tradition. Right? So this new sort of footing the United States was on is referred to by scholars as Wilsonian internationalism. Right? So it's got us doing all this stuff, including concluding all these FCN treaties that are sort of being revived. Right. So one of the important matters that's pertinent to World War II is that the United States has an FCN treaty with Japan that was concluded in 1919, or excuse me, 1921. The American treaty with Japan was concluded in 1921. So the United States and Japan's treaty was due to expire in December of 1941. And the United States had been threatening not to renew this treaty with Japan because of its actions in Manchuria and China, which we'll be talking about shortly here. So, if we were to just sort of take an overview of American foreign policy of the 1930s real quickly, we could say, first of all, that matters of trade and these FCN treaties, again, friendship, commerce, and navigation, this activity around trade and FCN treaties reflects concerns of World War I, right? And that means that free trade between nations, right? A lot of nations had been held under empires. There had been matters of contention over freedom of the seas, about blockades, right? About these sort of alliances that had existed prior to the war that sort of divided nations up. And so the United States is trying to restore normal commercial relations among the world's powers. And that's the whole idea of friendship, commerce, and navigation. That these, that trade is the great um, humanizing activity, right? It's the most um, functional form of intercourse between nations because it allows for peaceful exchange of products and a maintenance of good relations. And we can read this sort of commercial foreign policy theories. I mean, a good place to start where this is described is in a very old book by Felix Gilbert. It was published in 1961 called "To the Farewell Address," which was published by Princeton Press in 1961. Really breaks all these questions down very well. So they're old questions, but they remain important questions because they speak directly to the question of why do nations have relations, right? Like, why does one group of people interact with another, right? And commerce is always the best footing upon which that can happen, right? I mean, why are the Olympics important, right? They're supposed to be. It's not just about the sports; it's about the peaceful interaction, right? So it's just an important platform for friendly relations. Okay. Also, speaking about our overview of the foreign policy of the 1930s, the United States, um, in this country, many people are disillusioned after World War I, and this is going to be a major motivating factor um, with respect to the American global outlook during the 1930s. World War I disillusioned a lot of people. The United States made the world, quote unquote, safe for democracy. That's what we claimed. Um, Woodrow Wilson said that we want nothing from this war, and the United States got nothing from that war except for greater industry and a global position as now a new sort of budding world power. But aside from that, the United States got 118,000 dead soldiers, um, many hundred thousand more wounded or maimed soldiers, many people with and if you read in your textbook it talked about shell shock, which would today we would probably call PTSD, right? But many veterans coming back from World War One, fighting in that particular kind of war, in the trench warfare, which was really a horror show, right? We just saw the plight of the bonus army, right, and how a lot of those folks were treated, right? But then on the home front as well, right? You've had a lot of economic dislocation. You've had, you know, uh, sort of broken promises from the respect of the viewpoint of the African American community, who thought that involvement in this war and service in this war was going to lead to sort of greater um, social, political respect and equality at home. Right, that did not manifest. Women got their place in the workforce for a little while, and then for many of them, they were returned into domestic situations, things that did not interest them. Um, so, and I'm not looking to speak for all women here, because I'm sure there were women who were happy to just go back to being at home again and not working into a factory and let their husband go to the factory. I mean, I don't want to pre- presume to speak for all women, but many people in the United States stood after the First World War very disillusioned, right? And a lot of that is reflected in the literature, music, and art of the time period, right? I mean, the writings of what was called the lost generation of authors, right? So if we were to look at the American literature coming out of the 20s and 30s in the post-war period, authors like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, uh, Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, John Dos Passos, his famous USA trilogy, um, and then some of the cultural criticism coming out of authors like Sinclair Lewis, who wrote Main Street, Babbitt, Arrowsmith, Dodsworth, a number of sort of art, novels that were essays on American society, really. Um, you can see the sort of disillusionment with what America is becoming after the war, and the sense of why did we get involved in this in the first place. And this particularly is going to begin to crystallize in the early 1930s when we begin to look around the world and we see the expansion of Japanese militarism now in the 1931 to 33 period in Manchuria, when we begin to see the rise of Adolf Hitler and his antics in Germany, the rise of Benito Mussolini and the violence taking place in Italy. These are becoming highly militarized, visibly militarized states, and Hitler in particular will step by step begin to personally unravel the Versailles Treaty and violate one provision of it after another. So Americans are watching all of this taking place around the world through newsreel footage and radio reports and newspaper articles, and they begin to see that there's apparently another war looming out there, right? And they're already disillusioned about the participation in the first one, and so what there begins to become a groundswell uh, in the United States that we need some sort of neutrality legislation that's going to ensure that the United States will not get involved in what appears to be the next European war. Okay, so that's just sort of our very long uh, part one monologue here, right? So this is we can move on to the second part of the lecture outline if you have printed one from well, I guess you wouldn't print it, you'd just be checking it out on your device, right? Since I don't think you'd be bringing it to class, right? Um, so we'll talk about the emerging global crisis here. This is the second part of the lecture, and I just want to start. I just talked about things happening around the world, right? And so I want to just sort of detail those a little bit, talking about what's happening in Japan, what's happening in Germany, and then how the United States begins congressionally to start to respond to these things. Coffee break. Okay, so first in Japan. Japan, by the late 1920s, early 1930s, is under the rule of a highly militaristic regime. Of course, Japan has an emperor, but there is also a civil government. And the civil government of Japan, by the late 20s, very early 30s, has come under the domination of the military. There is quite a bit of infighting in Japanese sort of political military circles over which branch of the services would dominate. Right? Would it be the army or navy? There was quite a bit of infighting over who would be um, the predominant service with the larger voice in politics. Ultimately, Hideki Tojo from the army side becomes the premier of Japan. So he becomes like their prime minister, and he's in a sense, essentially, not in a sense, he's essentially a military dictator. Okay, so Tojo is a very much a thug. It's really no way to sort of sugarcoat it. He rules through fear and violence. Um, he was, I think his nickname was the Razor or something like that. This was not a nice guy, right? So he's the one running the country, and the Japanese at this point have come upon this idea that they want to throw the Europeans out of Asia. Okay, they want Asia for Asians, and they begin to sell to the world, that is the Eastern world, the East Asian world. They begin to sell to them the promise of something they're calling the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Okay. Co-prosperity means we are sharing the wealth, right? Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds like they want to create a situation where all of the peoples of Eastern Asia are commonly sharing their wealth. In other words, they're not going to have European powers coming over with colonies and extracting their wealth from them. Rather, they want to throw them out, and the Asians will all equally experience the prosperity of their own resources and work. This was a very noble-minded idea. And the Japanese would point directly to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and this idea of self-determination of nations that Wilson had raised in the 14 points and said, well, if self-determination of nations is such a good thing so that Norwegians can have a Norway, right? Well, that was 1912, but let's say if the Finns can have a Finland and the Czechs and the Slovaks can have a Czechoslovakia and the Poles can have Poland restored to the map, right? And the Slavic peoples can have a Yugoslavia, then why are all of you people still over here holding us in a colonial status? Now, the Japanese are not being held in a colonial status, but they're putting this propaganda out there to other East Asian peoples in order to sort of get them uh, more favorably inclined toward the Japanese. But what the Japanese mean by a greater East Asia coast prosperity fear is not that everyone in Asia will enjoy their wealth equally. They mean that the Japanese will equally enjoy everyone in Asia's wealth. I mean, they're just looking to kick the Europeans out so they can take it all over for themselves. Okay. Now, if we're to look at the setup in East Asia at this time of the early 1930s, the British still hold a significant colonial presence there in key points of trade, what we could call entrepôts, which are, if you look at the trading networks of Asia, some of these places have been key nodes or entrepôts in the Asian trading network, and you go back to, you know, the 1500s when the Portuguese and Dutch first started coming over into this part of the world to begin to dominate in the spice trades. Right, a lot of these points, contact points on key waterways, they have not changed. These places have been major trading points since the 1500s. So if I ever teach it again, introductory topics in world history, if I ever teach that one again, I'll be talking a lot about ports in Southeast Asia. So anyway, Britain holding Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore, and then of course a massive colonial presence in India and Burma. France controlling Indochina, right? So that is that area that would constitute Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, right? The United States had its own informal imperialist presence, right? We had U.S. Territories and protectorates, we call them, in the Philippines, Guam, which we got from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. And then there was Samoa, Wake Island, and the Midway Islands, right, which we had acquired back in 1867. And then Samoa was an interesting thing happened around Samoa, which I believe was around the late 1880s or 1890s. I don't remember the precise date. You can look this up on Wikipedia if you find it interesting. But American and German battleships actually arrived off the coast of Samoa at pretty much the same time looking to claim Samoa. And so you nearly had a naval conflict between the United States and Germany over the island of Samoa. And then it was decided to just divide the island so that there would be an American Samoa and a German Western Samoa, I think. So it was an interesting little sort of sideshow that amounted to not much, right? But the United States and Germany nearly had a set to over Samoa. And then, of course, Wake and Midway Islands, of course, as we know, are going to be very important in World War II. Guam's important in my family just because my Uncle George fought on Guam, my dad's brother, in World War II. And then the Dutch had a significant presence in what were called the Dutch East Indies at this time, but what is contemporarily known as Indonesia. So Indonesia, that whole archipelago of islands was a Dutch colonial possession. So the Japanese sought to lead a movement for Asians, ostensibly sought to lead a movement for Asian self-determination, but of course this was just a big sham, a whole lot of propaganda to cloak their own purposes, which was to just conquer Asia for themselves and become the predominant power in the entire uh, Pacific rim, ocean, you name it. Okay. Um, Also, many of these places that I just mentioned were key um, points for obtaining natural resources that were necessary for military operations, right? So for the Japanese, I don't want to use the term complex, but for the Japanese military industrial machine to operate, in order for them to be able to produce the armaments and the arms and the logistical transportation networks and things that they need for war, Japan is a very resource poor island and really needs the natural resources from the other Asian areas, which are controlled by Europeans. So, in order to get those natural resources, they need to get the Europeans out. Right, the Dutch East Indies, for example, massive supplies of petroleum and crude oil deposits. Right, battleships, tanks, airplanes, right, you name it, trucks. Right, you got to have petroleum and crude oil. Malaysia, large supplies of rubber and tin. Right, um, trucks, jeeps, motorcycles. Well, they don't have jeeps. The United States has jeeps. Trucks, motorcycles, airplanes, rubber's required. Tanks, right? Japan had already occupied Korea. So Korea at this time was still under Japanese control since 1905. The United States took over the Korean Peninsula as an outcome of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. So the Japanese had been systematically oppressing the people of Korea at this point for about 25 years. In 1931, the Japanese invade Manchuria. So Manchuria is the northeasternmost province of China. Okay, the, just to give you a quick background, the Manchu people from this northeastern part of China had operated the last great dynasty in Chinese imperial dynastic history, right? So the last emperor, quote unquote, really leaves, and I believe it was 1911, 1912, when Sun Yat-sen launched a sort of westernized liberal revolution in China that brought down the Qing dynasty. Now it's spelled with a Q, Qing, the Qing dynasty. So the Qing dynasty had replaced the Ming back in 1644. So the Ming, who had dominated China since about 1403, I think, and the Ming was considered the golden era of China. The Ming were a Han people, Han, and they were from sort of central eastern China. Okay, and the Han were the ethnically the most the largest population of the Chinese people were Han. Okay, they were sort of the ethnic majority of China. But in 1644, the Manchu came down from the northeast, scaled the walls, and of the Forbidden City and overthrew the Ming and installed a new dynasty called the Qing dynasty. Qing. So the Manchu people, the area of Manchuria, this was the sort of homeland of the last great Chinese imperial dynasty. So the Japanese invade this area. It's a rather isolated, somewhat, little barren kind of area. The landscape could, appear to be a bit sort of, it's very rural and could be a bit bleak in some areas, um, but extremely rich in minerals. Right now, of course, back in the 1640s, the Chinese were not mining for iron ore. They weren't heavily engaged with those kind of technologies. But the Japanese, there was a reason that the Japanese seized this area from Russia. Because of course they wanted to move the Russians back a little bit from the Pacific Rim there and create a greater security zone for Japan itself. But the Japanese also understand very well that this area, Korea and particularly Manchuria, is very rich in iron ore deposits and coal, which they need for making steel. So they invade Manchuria, they take it from the Chinese, they rename it Manchukuo, giving it a Japanese sort of name. And fighting there as the Japanese continue to expand their holdings in Manchuria continues till about 1933. The League of Nations reprimands the Japanese for their actions. Uh, the Japanese delegates to the League of Nations are highly offended by being reprimanded by the League of Nations, and they stand up and they put their top hats on and grab their attache cases and march out of the chamber. It's famous video footage of that. You can probably find that on the internet if you want to see it. Um, but that went to show you the full authority of the League of Nations, which is one of the reasons that the United States had a problem with it. Among other things, was all it could do was give an opinion, the weight of world opinion, but it had no enforcement power. There were no teeth to the League of Nations. So the Japanese were able to steal Manchuria from China, and the world did nothing about it. The world was exhausted from war. The world did not, no one wanted to get involved about this sort of remote distance province of northeastern China. And as a result of this, the Japanese have taken the measure of the Western powers, and they realize they're going to be able to get away with whatever they want. And so now border conflicts begin to arise um, with different Asian powers um, from the Japanese. And I can jump down ahead here, but as early as 1935, for example, the Japanese and Russians will fight in Mongolia in 1935. So the Japanese army begins pushing across out of Manchuria toward Western China and out into Mongolia, where the Soviet Union and Stalin begin to wonder, oh, okay, hey, what's going on here? There's a little too much expansionism. You're starting to get close to our borders. And the Red Army went out there under and the tank the army, the tanks there were led by Marshal Zhukov. I don't think he was a field marshal yet at this point. He might have just still been a general. He would, of course, become a major hero of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. But Zhukov and his tank forces will actually drive the Japanese back out of Mongolia. So Japanese expansionism becomes very clear by the early mid 1930s. In Europe, fascism begins to take hold in Germany and Italy in the 1920s. What is fascism, you might ask? So, excuse me, fascism was a political philosophy that is born in anti communism. Okay, so if we are to think about the political spectrum, with communism being at the extreme left of the political spectrum, fascism would be at the extreme right of the political spectrum. Fascism rises up under Benito Mussolini in Italy in the early 1920s to prevent a communist takeover of the Italian government in the wake of World War One. So many of the people who joined the fascist movement and Mussolini are World War One veterans of the Italian army who do not want to see the communists take control of the country after the war. And there's a lot of street violence. Okay, so the term fascism comes from the old Roman fasci, and it was the fasci was FASCI, was a bundle of rods sort of tied together. Okay, and these were carried around in the street when I forget the rank of the, was it a quaetor or praetor, would was a political figure, a local sort of a political person who had power and enforcement power, could punish people. And he would have one of his attendants carry the fasci through the street whenever this person, would go into the forum or through the streets of Rome. He had his little entourage with him who would carry the fasci with them. And this signified that this was a person who had power to wield, right, over others. So this becomes this ancient Roman symbol of wielding a punishing authoritative power becomes the symbology for this new movement under Benito Mussolini, who is promising to restore Italy to its former glory of Roman times, and wants to recreate a new Roman Empire around the whole Mediterranean basin. He would promising to restore the economy of Italy, restore it to times of past glory, restore the Italian people's pride in themselves and their nation, and just sort of bring back a new, again, like a new Roman glory to Italy. Um, Hitler, Adolf Hitler, who was of Austrian birth but moved to Germany, to the Bavaria area of southwestern Germany in the years just before the outbreak of the First World War. Um, Hitler had actually joined the German army when the war began. Some of you may not know this, but he joined the German army before, just at the outbreak of war, fought for 4 years in the trenches on the Western Front. So Adolf Hitler was an evil dictator. Um, but some people don't understand that he had actually fought. He had actually fought for 4 years and survived in the trenches of the Western Front. And he had been decorated for bravery too, had won one or two Iron Crosses. So he wasn't a lightweight, so to speak, as a soldier. Um, he organizes the National Socialist movement in Germany, and he bases what he's doing, his activity. So what we see these famous rallies, for example, of Hitler's in Nuremberg, and the whole symbology of the Nazi Party with the swastika and their whole sort of ritualistic and very theatrical way of motivating and trying to inspire the population. He based all of this on Benito Mussolini's sort of masterful use of propaganda, propaganda art, using the technology of radio, very theatrical public speaking. And so Adolf Hitler, I mean, we look back at World War II, we say, well, wow, Hitler was the real powerful one. And the Italian army wasn't very effective, and Mussolini was sort of this bumbling sidekick. But if you were to, rewind the tape to the 1920s, Adolf Hitler looked up to Benito Mussolini. He idolized Mussolini and based his rise to power on Mussolini. It was much later on when they met, and then when war began and Hitler began to understand the performance of the Italian army, that he began to lose respect for Mussolini and understood, okay, I'm actually the real power here. Right? But initially, Hitler looked up to Mussolini. Um, he was imprisoned in 1923 for his organizing and participation in the famous beer hall putsch, Putsch, in Munich, in Bavaria province of Germany in 1923, where it was an effort to sort of overthrow local government there by Hitler and his National Socialists. The revolt was put down. Hitler was thrown in prison and spent much of the 1920s in prison. While he was there, he wrote a sort of prophetic autobiography, if you will. So he wrote the famous book um, Mein Kampf, which in German translation means my struggle. So Hitler was living the struggle, right? And in his book, he actually spells out, in addition to explaining his uh, hatred for Jewish people, he also lays out his plans for Europe. In other words, the book is saying, this is what I'm going to do when I get out of here. And he went ahead and did all of it. So that the world was caught by surprise by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and early 1940s is absolutely flabbergasting. Sometimes we think people just talk and we don't really think they're serious. The one person that thought Adolf Hitler was serious was Winston Churchill. And he warned the world and warned the British people, we have to start preparing to deal with this guy. And nobody wanted to, when he started doing things that looked like he was going to do the things he said in his book, nobody wanted to believe it. Nobody wanted to deal with it. Nobody wanted conflict. And this is why dictators should not be appeased. Okay, so he wrote this book. He told the world what he was going to do. Nobody listened. Okay, except the people in Germany who were inspired by his book. And when he got out, he had a huge following, and there was a large core of people who wanted to see him do what he said he was going to do. And then the German nation just sort of got sucked into it. Okay? So Hitler is able to eventually take power in Germany in 1933. He had been elected to the position of Chancellor of Germany. And then he and his followers staged a coup, and he assumed power. So what they did was um, they actually lit the Reichstag, and I mentioned that in the First World War lecture. The Reichstag was the German parliament building, and they set it on fire, and then claimed that the government was under attack, and it was an emergency situation. And so Hitler then assumed dictatorial powers to help guide Germany through this national emergency until the people who were responsible for this rebellion were caught and put to death, and the nation was saved. Problem was he never gave the power back, and the National Socialists or Nazis took over the country, and the rest, as they say, is history. So why were so many people inspired by Adolf Hitler? What did he have to offer besides what we take on surface as hatred of Jewish people? What was he actually doing that appealed to people in Germany? Well, first of all, he was an extremely good propagandist. He was an extremely flamboyant speaker that sort of mesmerized audiences, whipped them up into a frenzy. And he practiced and practiced and practiced. Practiced in front of a mirror. He practiced. Okay, so he took his speaking as an art. Okay, number two, he scoffed at the Western democracies. Okay, when we tend to hate on those who beat us, right? Um, Philadelphia Eagle fans love to hate the Dallas Cowboys, right? Now, and where does that come from? So some of you say, well, we've been pretty good for a while, and we've been. Well, I don't know why I hate the Cowboys because, my parents raised me to, right? Okay, fair enough. Mine did too. And it really comes out in the 1960s and 70s when the Eagles weren't very good and the Cowboys were, and they would rub the Eagles' faces in it and run up the score on them all the time and cheap shots and this and the smugness of the coach Tom Landry, right? And they became very easy to hate. So this has been handed down generationally, right? So I grew up with, my parents had season tickets at Franklin Field, and I heard the horrors when they came home from the games, right? So Germany, who had been defeated by France and Britain and the United States in the First World War, would publicly insult the Western powers, deride them, criticize them, mock them. And the people ate it up. The people ate it up. Okay. Um, People feared communism. During the Great Depression, as I mentioned, Hitler had started these massive public works projects and um, began a military buildup that was forbidden by the Versailles Treaty that put a lot of German people to work. Okay, so prosperity begins to come back in Germany in the 1930s. People begin to make money again. Communism, which had taken root in the Soviet Union, involved a government seizure of all private property. So the last thing the people in Germany want is their property being seized, right? The haves don't want to lose what they have, right? So because communism is a threat and fascism is an anti-communist ideology, that will resonate with the people. Okay. Also, communism is an atheistic um, political philosophy. In other words, religion in the Soviet Union was banned. Okay, we talk about freedom of religion in the United States. Communism bans religion because there should only be worship of the state. Okay, so therefore, the Catholic Church in Germany, people always say Hitler had this thing with the Pope. Why? Well, that's because fascism and Hitler guaranteed protection of the church from communism. Okay, so middle class people will support Hitler because he's going to protect their what they own, their homes, their businesses, their properties, and the church, its survival is guaranteed. So there are numbers of reasons why German people are lining up behind him. At the same time, um, you have uh, people in Germany who are seeing the writing on the wall, are very fearful of what Hitler looks like he's going to do and is beginning to do, and they begin leaving Germany while they're still able to get out. They're trying to. So Americans can see all these things happening in the early 1930s, between 1933 and 1935, and they want to stay out of another war. Americans want to remain isolationist. Now, what does that mean, being isolationist? Well, in 1935, that means just we're going to isolate ourselves and not get involved in European matters like we were before World War I. Right? In 1935 and 1936, the Gallup Company took a poll, Gallup poll, and that's spelled, by the way, with a U, not an O. It's not like Gallop on a horse, right? But it's Gallup. A Gallup poll taken in 1935, 1936, of the people polled in the United States, 80% of Americans said the United States should steer clear of any European war and remain neutral. And so, because of that, Congress will begin to pass a series of neutrality acts. Okay, so let's talk about that. So we're moving on down to talk about isolationism and neutrality here. That's part 2C on your outline if you're following along on the outline. So let me begin to talk about these neutrality acts. This is going to be a little longer lecture than a lot of them. It always is. The world's a big place. Okay. So, 1934, first of all, the Congress appointed a committee to look into how the United States got into World War I. Huh? I thought we were talking about another war coming. Yeah, we are. But one of the things Congress wanted to decided to sort out in the 1930s was, why did we get into the last war? And so if we can understand clearly why we got into the last war, we can take measures to make sure that those same things don't happen again that would get us into a second war. In other words, what American policies and practices, when we were trying to stay neutral in the 1910s, wound up failing and getting us into war anyway. So the committee that came out of this was the Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, the SMIC, the Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, which is better known to history as the Nye Committee, NYE, named after its chairman, the Republican senator from North Dakota, Gerald Nye. And again, they're tasked with looking into how the United States got into World War I. So essentially, they're trying to prevent World War I. I mean, it's an interesting committee to look at, which I actually did as a graduate student. I wrote a very lengthy research paper on the Nye committee. And actually, if you want to read, they held trials, kind of a show trial. Actually, very interesting stuff. The Senate committee brought in all the chiefs of American industry and sort of had them testify in front of Congress about their activities in the 1910s. So you can imagine the American public in the 1930s suffering under the Great Depression, right? People who are selling apples on street corners. And now they're hearing that Congress, the Senate particularly, are bringing in the leaders of DuPont and GM and all these U.S. Steel and forcing them to testify in front of Congress. And they're being publicly grilled for their profiteering 20 years before. And the American people are sort of eating this up. So in in some ways, there's I mean this was uh, my conclusion again. This is as a graduate student 20 some years ago. Um, because our perceptions always change over time as we move on in life. But it seemed to me that the Republican dominated committee at this time was trying to make a little political hay here, as these congressional committees often do, in trying to show that we can't let big business get away with a bunch of nonsense, and they're going to have to be accountable for all this. So this helped to, I think, in some ways, show the public that the Republicans weren't just stoolies or tools of big business, right? But at the same time, they were not looking to get into war here either, right? Roosevelt is president, and Roosevelt had been Undersecretary of the Navy during the First World War. I think it was called Assistant Secretary by that time. And he comes out of that sort of Wilsonian tradition, right? He had been appointed to that position by Wilson. And so they want to keep a close eye on him, too, because Roosevelt has already shown that he's pretty darn maverick, and he's going to do what he wants to do, right? And the Republicans have caught on to that pretty quickly. Of course, they're a great minority in both the House and Congress. So this sort of committee gives them some sort of a platform also, right? So anyway, here's what they came up with. And if you ever want to research this, the Hagley Museum and Library, which is in northern Wilmington, Delaware, has the bound, I think, 16 bound volumes, big bound volumes of all the all the testimony before the Senate committee of all these people is in bound volumes. I used it for my own research. So it's a beautiful reading room, too, if you ever go down there. Anyway, um, they're trying to prevent World War One, and what they determined was that the munitions industry had a vested interest in war. Okay, and what had happened during the First World War was that these producers of munitions and armaments had lobbied Congress so that the British could buy these weapons from the United States. DuPont and U.S. Steel were two of the big ones, right? U.S. Steel produced the shell casings, and DuPont produced the powder that went in the explosive shells. These were two of the companies. This is why Hagley Library, which is funded by the DuPont Corporation, has all these volumes there. It's part of the DuPont history. So DuPont and U.S. Steel were two of the chief lobbyists at this time who had been lobbying Congress to loosen up the sales of these things um, to the British. So what had brought attention to this question was an article that was published in 1934 in Fortune magazine that was titled "The Merchants of Death." And it was looking at the role of international munitions companies, arms manufacturers. It's real Lord of War kind of stuff, right? It's looking at the role of these international arms manufacturers and how they were continuing to sell weapons to small nations and stuff to keep them fighting with each other in order that they could make profits. It was an expose article uh, put out by Fortune in 1934 that exposed the activities of all these different companies around the world, American companies like Electric Boat Company and Colt, British companies like Vickers, French companies like Schneider Kreuzer, Krupp's manufacturers, all these different companies, and how they were continuing to sort of stoke up and instigate wars. And they pointed particularly to an ongoing war between Bolivia and Paraguay, known as the Chaco War. I think there was a first, second, and maybe even third Chaco War. They're just looking for people to sell weapons to. And this sort of article, which caught major headlines, then sort of precipitated these Senate hearings. Okay, so One of the things that the Nye Committee determines here is that the munitions industries, because of their vested interests in profits, um, are interested in war. Okay. The second big outcome of the Nye Committee in their findings was, so number one, American industries need to be watched because they've got an interest in selling their stuff. So if they want to sell stuff to people at war, and this was one of the things that got us into the war. Remember, we're sending all these arms and munitions over to Britain. This is causing German U-boats to sink our ships. Okay, let me just tie that directly to World War One. So there's one cause of war, us selling stuff to people at war. The other was Woodrow Wilson. They blamed Woodrow Wilson for the war because he was too British. Because as we've discussed, his neutrality policies were extremely one sided in favor of the British. So we weren't really neutral. So, therefore, what should be done about this in order to keep America out of a second European war? Well, what we need, according to the Nye Committee, we need legislation, and this is public opinion too. This is not just the Nye Committee. This is public opinion building out from what's going on with the Nye Committee. We need legislation to dictate policy to the president. The legislature needs to dictate neutrality policy to the executive to prevent a president from dragging us into a war. Okay? And this legislation has to deal with two particular things tied to the two things I just mentioned. Number one, American passengers on belligerent ships. American passengers cannot be traveling on ships of belligerent nations. So if two nations are at war, American passengers should travel at their own risk, right? Remember the Lusitania, what that did to public opinion, 128 Americans, right? Could have taken us into the war, could have taken us into the war right then, really colored our perceptions of Germany and its submarine warfare. Okay? So, number one, we need legislation that says flat out, if you want to get your dumb butt on a ship of some nation that's at war with some other nation, and that ship gets sunk, the rest of the United States is not going to war because you were dumb enough to get on that ship. Okay? Number two, an embargo on munitions sales to belligerents. We cannot sell weapons to anybody who's at war. Doesn't matter if we like them or we don't like them. If we think they started it or we think they're the victim. We don't sell them to anybody, and that obviates this whole issue of our transport of those goods or arms being a cause for attacks on our transport of those goods and us getting involved because our people are being attacked or our ships are being attacked. Right? So these were two main things. Um, at the same time this year, an independent author named Walter Millis had been writing a book on this topic. Okay, Millis, and this is a great book you can get through our library. I read it. I borrowed it from our library when I worked on this paper in the Nye Committee. I was a grad student at Delaware, but I believe the book is in the Rutgers probably library annex. You can order this book. Great book to read, called "The Road to War." It was published in 1934 or early 1935 by Walter Millis. Really, really interesting stuff if you're interested in the sort of causes of World War One, causes of World War Two. It's great study written at the time, and this became a national bestseller in 1935. And Millis's findings in this book, The Road to War, which studied American entry in the First World War, agreed with what the Nye Committee was also finding. So, and again, this became a best-selling book. So it's not just Congress, it's not just Senate Republicans who are coming up with this. This is becoming popular American opinion that's building up the cause of American isolationism in the 1930s and building the sort of clamor for neutrality legislation. So the result of all this sort of firestorm of public opinion, is the Neutrality Act of 1935. And the way that the act was set up was that the act would go into force, it would go into effect when the President of the United States declared a conflict between two nations to be a war. Okay, when the president declared a conflict to be a war, this law, the Neutrality Act, would go into effect. Sounds good. But how does that dictate to the president? Not all laws are good laws. That's why laws are frequently modified, right? That's why bills get modified. There are second versions of them because there are loopholes sometimes, and sometimes there are unforeseen loopholes, and there are unforeseen consequences. The problem with the Neutrality Act of 1935 was that it favored aggressor nations, unintentionally favored aggressor nations. Okay. First of all, here's what the law did, and then we'll talk about why that is so. Okay. The law prohibited arms sales to all sides in a war. Could not sell to either side. Number two, U.S. citizens would travel on belligerent ships at their own risk. Okay, if the president says this is a war, then the act goes into effect. And if any Americans want to travel on the ships of either of those two nations, they do so at their own risk, and the United States is not responsible for your actions. And we will not, defend you or your memory, right? Here's one of the questions that arises from this. How long can the president get away with saying a nation was or wasn't, or excuse me, how long could the president get away with saying a conflict was or wasn't a war? Okay, so sometimes North Korea and South Korea will have a little thing where they'll catch one of the other countries' mini subs spying on them or something like that, right? They'll catch it. And then they take the sailors and then they become released, right? President could say, oh, that's a war. That's a war. Does that make sense? No, it's an incident, right? So sometimes we have these little skirmishes, these little incidents. They don't really rise to the level of a war. It's uh, sometimes an intemperate action by a localized commander that nobody wants to see escalate into a war, right? So a president would want to take a pretty measured response to this, right? For example, some of our naval ships are being harassed in the Straits of Hormuz by Iranian gunboats, right? These guys have these very well armed sort of speedboats that are sort of pirates use off the Horn of Africa, right? And the Iranians are a little better armed than these Sudanese or Somalian pirates, right? And what they're doing is they're just running circles around American ships, making dangerous sort of gestures, just sort of harassing our ships. Okay, now President Trump could say that's an act of war, but he has chosen not to do that, right? Although he did say yesterday that they do that again, we're going to blow them out of the water. Okay, we're not going to have them messing with our ships. They do it again, we're going to blow them out of the water. Now, what are our ships doing there? Well, they're protecting global oil from moving through that area. But the president has the opportunity to say something is or is not a war, what rises to the level of a war. So that gives the president actually more power here than probably Congress intended. Okay. Number two, it favors the aggressor because a nation is not likely to start a conflict unless they're prepared to do so. Okay. So this will become very, very obvious in 1935 when Italy attacks Abyssinia, which we know as Ethiopia. Okay, and the what's known as the Abyssinian War or the Italo-Ethiopian War of 1935, which was a sickening bloodbath, really, just really heinous attack by Benito Mussolini and the Italians on the peaceable people of Ethiopia who were minding their own business. The Italians already had a large colony in East Africa, Italian Somaliland, which modern Somalia, and they now decide to expand their holdings. The Italians at this point in time control Libya, they control Italian Somaliland, and now they move on Ethiopia. The Italians have their own arms industry. They have a very large navy. They've got an air force with modern bomber planes. They've got tanks. They've got poison gas. The Italians have their own substantial weapons industry under this dictator Mussolini that he's been developing for the last almost 15 years. The Ethiopians are armed with late 19th century weapons. Okay. Um, they, in some cases, they're fighting with less than that. Okay. And they bravely try to defend their country, but they can't hold up for more than a few months um, just because of the weapons that the Italians possess. And so the way that the Italians attack and massacre these people is really sickening to the global community. However, and that's not a term I use very often, by the way, to the world of nations, let's say. I think I like that better. But anyway, no one can help Ethiopia. The United States, under this legislation, when President Roosevelt declared that this was a war, the United States could not, on a humanitarian basis, attempt to help the Ethiopians. And they were therefore left to their fate. And this was a great, I mean, today we would look at this happening somewhere in the world and find this to be a great wrong, right? But there was nothing that could be done. And if you've ever seen the film Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart, he plays the character Rick Blaine, one of my all-time favorite movie characters. And speaking to Rick's romanticism, you know, the French prefect played by Claude Rains is bringing up the fact that, oh, come on, you're a romantic at heart. You ran guns to the Ethiopians back in 1935, right? So there were people who were sort of patriots who were trying to help the Ethiopians back at that time in a clandestine fashion, independently, but soldiers of fortune types, right? But it was not enough. So this indicated that some change was going to be needed in this law because the law favored aggressors, right? Secondly, another thing that will show the holes in this war would be the holes, excuse me, in this legislation was the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. Okay, so in 1936, a civil war starts in Spain, and it was a war between the army and the government. A general of the Spanish army, who was a fascist, Francisco Franco, and he was in control of the Spanish army, and he wanted to get rid of the loyalist. He wanted to get rid of the Spanish government, the existing sort of civil government of Spain, and replace it with a fascist military dictatorship led by himself. Okay, he was a big fan of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, and he wanted to make Spain a third. Well, it wouldn't have been the third. There were already at this point fascist governments had arisen in both Hungary and Romania by this time, but now uh, Franco wants to lead Spain into the position of being a third major um, fascist power. So the civil war breaks out. It looks like on the surface a military coup d'état with the Spanish army overthrowing the government. The government of Spain now it begins arming people on the streets from its arsenals that are set up throughout the country, and the people of Spain are now forming these loyalist militias to try to fight the army for control of the nation. So this coup d'état by Franco turns into a civil war. The Neutrality Act of 1935 does not apply to this conflict because it is an internal domestic conflict in Spain. So the United States begins selling arms. Congress approves the sales, and we begin selling arms to the Spanish quote unquote loyalists to stop this fascist takeover of Spain. Here's what happens: the loyalists, these militias in Spain that are fighting Franco and the fascists, are dominated by the Spanish communists. So, also, communists throughout Europe and North America, and even Russia, begin flooding into Spain to join up with these militias to help try to stop the further spread of fascism. So, brigades of just sort of communist volunteers from Russia, from England, France, Belgium, Canada, and even the United States begin flocking into Spain to try to help stop the spread of fascism and reverse this takeover. The Americans actually who go are call themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and you can find PBS videos on them, like our Bonus Army March. They did one on the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. These were American communist idealists who went over to try to help fight the Spanish fascists. So, and the Spanish fascists are very well armed because they're getting help from Hitler and Mussolini, who are using Spain as a proving ground or a test point for a lot of their new weaponry. So, for example, the famous German Stuka dive bombers from World War II, where they have that sort of threatening sounding siren when they dive to sort of the whole point is to just inspire terror in the people below. It's just a psyops sort of feature of the plane. But it's a precision dive bomber. These are first tested out in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So the fascists are helping Franco, the other fascist powers. The United States is sending arms and supplies to the loyalists, and then Congress learns that the loyalists are communists. And when Congress and the American people find out that the taxpayers are funding and arming communists, it creates a gigantic backlash now. Therefore, Congress reenacts the neutrality law because and decides it's time to pass, in other words, pass a new neutrality law. So in 1936 now, Congress takes the neutrality law and reforms it. Okay, with a new piece now that extends the provisions of the 1935 law to cover civil wars. Okay, so the provisions of the neutrality law are extended now to cover civil wars. So this is the Neutrality Act of 1936. Okay, and this is where the United States now will stand. That the neutrality legislation has remained the same, but now as a result of the Spanish Civil War, it has been extended to cover internal conflicts or civil wars within nations. The last of the neutrality legislations that I want to talk about today was passed after the actual beginning of World War II in Europe. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead now to 1939, where in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland. This happened on September the 1st, 1939. This was done again under pretexts. The Germans, I believe it had said that a German radio station had been attacked by Polish forces, and therefore Germany had to retaliate. So they go sweeping over the Polish border on September the 1st. At this point in time, Germany had taken over Austria in 1938 in what's known as the Anschluss, or in German, the joining, where Austria allowed itself to be absorbed into Germany. Germany had also taken over Czechoslovakia in 1938, first taking the Sudetenland area of northwestern Czechoslovakia. And then a few months later, after the Munich conference had um, created peace, in other words, the Germans had guaranteed that was all that they wanted of Czechoslovakia. They weren't going to try to take any more. Hitler satisfied the French and British that there was no need for a war between all these powers because we just got the part of Czechoslovakia we wanted, the part where all the German people lived and were being oppressed. Um, Also, the most mountainous and easily defendable part of the country was given away. And then a few months later, the Germans just roll down out of the hills and take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, which was a modern, heavily armed, very defensible nation with a big army and its own arms industry. And Hitler took it over without firing a shot. So everybody knows the game now. Unfortunately, the Western powers, because they wanted to have peace, allowed this country, whose sovereignty they were ostensibly protecting, to be taken over by Hitler without firing a shot. So when Hitler rolls into Poland September 1st, Britain now gives Germany a 2-day ultimatum. At this point, they can't avoid it any longer. And Germany is given an ultimatum by Britain and France. You have 2 days to get out of Poland. If you don't, it's going to mean war. Um, Hitler laughs and ignores this ultimatum. So 2 days later, on September the 3rd, Britain, France declare war, and Canada then also declares war on Germany independently of Britain and France. An important point that's always typically missed, that Canada, as an independent nation, also declared war on Hitler, um, but independently of France and Britain. Okay, this war that was predicted by Churchill, this war that Americans thought they saw coming for the last 5 years, is now happening. So we enter in the year, and this is the last piece I'm going to talk about here today, between September 1939 and December 7th of 1941, of course, when Pearl Harbor is attacked, the United States finds itself in what we can best and most appropriately call a period of American pro-Allied neutrality. Okay, we are neutral, but in other words, we are not fighting, but we are avowedly pro-Allied. We are going to help. You know, we find Germany to be completely 100% at fault here, and we make no bones about that. We want to see the British and France and Canada win, right? These are our friends. Germany is not anyone's friend. Right? That's the position the United States takes. So it becomes an armed neutrality, a period of what we can call semi-belligerence, okay, on the part of the United States. This American neutrality is very different than the neutrality of 1917 and the years prior to 1917. I mean, that's the important point we want to make. Okay, under Woodrow Wilson, we were hedging our bets, claiming to be completely neutral, saying that we weren't favoring one side or the other, and trying to stay out of things. This is a very different. We are making no bones about the fact that we are for this side, we are against the other side, and we now begin discussing ways that we're just going to go ahead and help the one side that we do favor here. So Congress debates this. Congress begins now. We're of course boxed in by the neutrality law of 1935, which has been updated in 1936. So in these 2 months between September and November of 1939, 2 months of debate go on in Congress about changing the existing neutrality law. At this point, up to this point, for these 2 months after the war breaks out, Roosevelt had embargoed arms and strategic supplies to the Allies. We have no intention whatsoever of sending anything to Germany, but we're bound by the law. We can't send anything to Britain, France, or Canada. Congress and the public, again, believed that our neutrality law favored the aggressor. We saw that in 1935 when the Italians attacked Ethiopia. nobody could do a thing. Now, here again, Germany is a very, very heavily gunned up nation, right? Uh, I mean, they've been developing a massive army, a massive navy, um, uh, massive amounts of planes and tanks, and France and Britain have not. No one has been gearing up for this war except Germany. So once again, they've got the upper hand at this point. They're ready for this war. No one else is. And so our neutrality law is again showing it favors the aggressor because we can't help those who are not prepared. Um, the U.S. had no alliances at this time. We are not formally allies of France and Britain. We are bound by no contracts or treaties. Okay, we do have FCN treaties that say we have ambassadors, we trade, we're cool, but that's it. Okay, we're not involved in any military alliance. So Roosevelt goes to Congress during these months and asks for a redefinition of the neutrality law so we can circumvent these embargoes and do something to help the Allies. And the result of this, which is passed by Congress in November of 1939, is the 1939 Neutrality Act, which is better known to history as the Cash and Carry Law. Okay, and so what this law stated was that in time of war, belligerent nations could buy arms and supplies and stuff from the United States, but they had to meet three criteria. Okay, first, you must have, excuse me. Okay, sorry for the interruption. Teleworking involves being stuck home in the home with two boys with too much energy and a dog. So let's go back to the 1939 neutrality law. Three criteria for this law. First of all, if the Allies wanted to get supplies from the United States so we could help them, they must have the money in the United States in our banks on account, right? France has to have money on account in US banks in order to purchase the goods. This addressed the problem from the First World War of us loaning a bunch of money to these people so they could buy stuff, right? So, part of the criticism of US entry into the war, you'll recall, was the United States had made such great loan expenditures to France and England. We wanted to make sure they didn't lose so we'd get our money back, right? So this would obviate that circumstance by saying you must have the cash. Okay. Number two, the goods must not be transported in U.S. ships. Okay, that's the carry, right? So one of the other big problems for us getting involved in World War One was the fact that our ships were being sunk taking goods to Britain. Okay, so to prevent that from happening again, now you have to carry it yourself. So the British have to come get the stuff. What actually happened, the way it actually worked in reality was the goods were picked up by the Canadians, or the United States took the goods up to Halifax in Canada, or Canadian ships would pick up the goods in the United States and transport them. So the British and Canadians were transporting the goods, and Halifax, Nova Scotia became the real sort of center of that transportation. Okay, and then lastly, flags of convenience would be used to transport oil. Okay, so Americans would ship oil to the Allies to help them, but these would be carried under either Panamanian or Canadian flags with ships with non-US crews. So American oil tankers might be used, but they would fly, they would be manned by crews of sailors that were not American, and they would travel under what were called flags of convenience, which were typically Panamanian, but at times also Canadian. You'll recall the United States had a substantial control of Panama at this point because of the canal. Okay. So that was the 1939 neutrality law, the last of the three neutrality acts. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there, and we'll pick up in the next lecture talking about World War II as it developed, how the United States got involved in the war, and we'll move forward with that in the next lecture. Okay, so this is the last material you need to know for Midway quiz number 2, and I'll see you soon in the next lecture.